Welcome back. It seems like another age when David Cameron stood in Downing Street having formed a coalition government with the Liberal Democrats and promised better things to come. Although the Conservatives have remained in power since 2010, we've had 5 prime ministers, resulting in 6 different sorts of government since Cameron led both a coalition and a Tory administration. Next year, it seems likely that Labour will oust the Tories from office, and if so, how will history remember this tumultuous period of rule? One early draft of that history has already been written by the Telegraph's political editor Ben Riley-Smith. His book, The Right to Rule, 13 years, 5 prime ministers and the implosion of the Tories, is out now. And Ben joins me. Congratulations on the book, which I enjoyed very much indeed.
Thank you.
You talk about the genius of the Conservative Party in changing leaders very frequently, and you contrast it with the Labour Party, which finds it much harder to change its leaders. Tell me about that.
Well, one of the things I was trying to do with this book is to work out how they have done this 13-plus year run. You know, longer than New Labour now. If you look back at the last century, only that Thatcher major period was longer for a single party in office. Talk to 120-plus key players to try and understand how it works. And, yeah, you're absolutely right. The mechanisms by which the 2 main parties get rid of their leaders was kind of really telling and a critical part of that story. So with the Tories, as you know, there is this no confidence letters system, and you need 15% of MPs to submit letters of no confidence to trigger a vote. With Labour, the threshold is 20%. Labour doesn't actually have a no-confidence mechanism. People have to go on the record and say, I want to back this particular person to be leader rather than our current leader. Whereas the Tories, it's much more loose. It's just a letter totally anonymously to trigger a thumbs-up, thumbs-down vote in the leader. And it means basically MPs are much more empowered to get rid of a leader when they want to.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? Because you would think this was a formula for instability. And in a way, indeed, it has been 5 prime ministers, for Pete's sake. But you're saying it's a good formula for staying in office.
Well, I think it depends whether, if you believe that MPs have the political nous to work out when their leader is out of step with the public, they can move very quickly. I mean, the classic example is in the wake of the Brexit referendum. The Tories very quickly picked a replacement to David Cameron. Labour MPs wanted to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn, the leader at the time. They kind of manufactured a vote where 80% plus of the MPs said, we don't have confidence in the leader. And yet he said, right, well, I'm not going to go. There was eventually a contest that was triggered and he was voted back in by the members. So Labour MPs fell out of confidence with their leader but couldn't get rid of him. You'd never have that situation with the Tories.
Well, of course, when the Tories were dealt up by their membership in the country, as it were, the wrong Prime Minister, they got rid of her within, what was it, 43 days?
49 days.
49.
She resigned after 45 days. Yeah, I mean, so supporters of the system say, look, we realised an error had been made. We moved very swiftly to get rid of her.
An absolute monarchy tempered by regicide, somebody said. Was that George Osborne said that?
That was William Hague.
William Hague.
And that came from the coalition talks where 2010, the Lib Dems said, look, I think first we should talk through our processes. We need a special conference. We need our members to sign it off, our MPs. The Tories kind of looked at each other and said, well, we just need David Cameron to agree, and if he's up for it, then we'll get it past the party. So they're much freer and abler to move where the public opinion is, the Tories.
When I looked at your book, I appreciated, with fresh clarity, that the key moment in all of this is, I think, the decision of David Cameron to hold a referendum on being part of the European Union. Everything that's flowed since then has been as a consequence of that. Tell us a bit about how he took the decision and what he thought the consequences of his decision might be.
Well, I think so I have a whole chapter about that decision, and I think you're absolutely right. That is the kind of before and after moment of this period. And I call it sliding doors because there are so many moments where possibly David Cameron could have gone down another path. I mean, it's kind of a riddle. How does a Prime Minister determined to keep Britain in the European Union end up delivering the exact opposite? And I think it is in this relationship. Well, you are very exposed with that 15% figure. So David Cameron in his memoir says, I'm always having that 15% figure in my mind. And it means you have to keep on side your coalition. And he was very alive to the Eurosceptic wing of the party. So if you go all the way back to 2005 and when he ran for leader, he agreed to pull the Tories out of this EPP, this European Parliament collection they were in, because that was what the Eurosceptics were demanding. And then in the years that come, there were a number of points when he said, look, I'm getting pressure from my Eurosceptics. Why don't I give them a bit of the red meat thereafter and hopefully it will calm down? And that kind of ratchets up and ratchets up and ratchets up. And I suppose in the end they thought, look, to somehow win the 2015 election, UKIP is surging with a very clear, simple message of getting out the EU. So why don't we offer a referendum in the hope we'll win it, keep my coalition together for 2015. If we get to that point, we'll win the referendum. I would have kind of burst the bubble of the Eurosceptics.
Do you think he thought that the Conservatives would have a majority after 2015, or might he have thought conversely that he was unlikely to have a majority and therefore that he could make the promise because he wouldn't have to deliver it if he had a new coalition government with the Liberal Democrats?
Well, that is the accusation made against him, and some senior European political figures are on record saying, oh, this is what David Cameron was saying. I put that to him when I interviewed him, actually, and he said, no, that's just not true. Go back to look at what I was saying in the campaign. It was so clear that it was a red line, and we wouldn't have been able to negotiate ourselves around it. But actually, George Osborne, I think, thinks it could have been possible to push it back and push it back and push it back after winning a majority. And the Lib Dems, I talked to Danny Alexander, and they said, look, we wouldn't have signed up to another coalition unless they got rid of it. So that one's up for debate.
Are there precedents for a government following entirely contradictory policies? So, I mean, the Tories were the party for Remain, and, of course, since the referendum, they've been the party for Leave. Are there many historical precedents for a party pursuing completely opposite policies during a continuous period in office?
You know what, you're probably better answering that than me because you understand the Conservative Party's history.
Well, I give you one example, but it's not on the same scale. But, you know, we introduced the poll tax as our flagship policy and abolished it within the same parliament.
Yeah.
And that's pretty unusual. But, of course, the consequences of leaving the European Union are so broad. I suppose, you know, you'd have to think about the Corn Laws or something like that for the breadth of impact. But I think basically it doesn't really have much of a precedent. I suppose you could say that the Tories were at one time the appeasers during the 1930s, and then they become the party of war. That might be a sort of equivalent.
And I suppose there are smaller U-turns. I mean, the one that's thrown at them recently is you are supposed to be the party of low tax, and yet this parliament has been the biggest tax-raising parliament of any since the Second World War. And they would say, oh, because of COVID, and we had to step in and this huge fiscal support for the economy. But saying one thing and doing another, I suppose, on a looser sense, is quite common.
Very briefly, have you been surprised by the amount of strife within the party that you've discovered? I mean, this party is now characterised by internecine strife, isn't it?
Yeah, well, one thing that really struck me talking to all these politicians is just how deep the pain is from various different camps. I mean, there's real visceral dislike when you talk to the Boris camp or the Liz Truss camp about the Rishi Sunak camp. There's real visceral dislike when you talk about the David Cameron camp, about Boris Johnson's team in particular and how he went against them on Brexit. I mean, those wounds are very real and very raw, and actually you're seeing it playing out this weekend with Nadine Dorries' book, which essentially is arguing Boris fell not because of any flaws himself or failures, but others moving against him.
I personally am still trying to get over the fall of Margaret Thatcher. Thank you very much, Ben Riley-Smith. A great book.